Welcome to our 2021 DIA one-on-one video series with Ronan Brown, Global Head of IQVIA Decentralized Trial Solutions, Integrated Technology and Compliance. Hi, Ronan. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Taryn. Nice to be here.
And we're going to talk about one of the hottest topics this year, and that's DCTs. As sponsors consider decentralized approaches to make trials more patient-centric, where's a good place for them to start?
Taryn, it's a great question. And I think there's a couple of areas that I would like to emphasize here. The first is we have seen a huge increase in DCTs, and a lot of that has been on as a contingency due to COVID.
Sure.
But I think that hasn't been the optimal approach. And moving forward, the emphasis really has to be on what strategy do you want to implement? Are you trying to accelerate your study? Are you trying to reach different patient populations that are harder to recruit? And so really building in from the very beginning, the approach, because that then dictates how you set your study up. And, in terms of what would you collect at each visit, what can then be done on a remote basis, really should be baked in at the very front when you're looking at the design versus we've seen a lot of in the last year, which has been more of the contingency, backup strategies if you can't get into sites.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense, especially since we went from, full speed to no speed. Now we're back to somewhat of a normal speed. So is there one key thing that you would recommend to sponsors aside from thinking about it at the protocol design that they need to do?
Yes, I think really engaging with teams that have lived and breathed some of the operational challenges. The critical change that you see when you're moving to a decentralized study is really around some of the logistics operation when you operationalize it. So you can have all the technology in the world, but really it's the fundamentals around how do you get drug to patients? What are the implications on that when it comes to your clinical trial supplies? How your shipments of those clinical, the certain, medical devices that you need in studies, whether it's the connected devices, how do you get them to patients? Do you go via the site or not? This is really, the logistics side of it is much more complicated than people, think about at the very beginning.
That makes a lot of sense. And, when we talk about those logistical things, a lot of it also comes down to the ROI. So how can we measure the ROI for sponsors using decentralized clinical trial models? And is it different than the traditional trial model?
It's a really tough question. And everyone asks me this because clinical trial decentralized studies are so new that we don't actually have those metrics. The view is that you can reduce the number of non-performing sites because you can cast a wider net. You can reduce patient burden, so they're more likely to take part in studies. So your recruitment will hopefully increase. And then because the burden on the patient is lessened in terms of the number of visits they would have to do to a site, the distance they might have to travel, you would then anticipate a lower dropout. We've seen some of that, but we're still running out studies that started last year. And prior to that, the experience was so limited, you couldn't really do a like-for-like comparison with two studies that were designed the same, one with a decentralized approach and another that was doing a traditional approach. So the metrics you would look for would be number of non-performing sites, accelerated recruitment, patient satisfaction surveys in terms of the burden, dropout rates. The other one that you might look at, but I'm not sure how you get to the data, would be, distance from sites of patients. Can you get to a wider catchment area? But you only get that in a DCT study where you know where the patient lives. You don't get that in a traditional study where they're coming to the site. So that one's a harder metric to measure.
And that leads me to another question is that should we be looking at different types of metrics for decentralized clinical trials because they're not the same as a traditional trial?
Well, I think when decentralized studies first envisioned in the world of virtual studies without sites, one of the key and hopes was they would be much cheaper than a traditional site-based model. And what we've seen is that actually most of the studies we run are in this hybrid model. So the traditional metrics in terms of ROI still apply, and it's really going to be a comparison in terms of, do you get that accelerated recruitment? Do you get to patient populations that you would not normally see enrolling in studies? And can you maintain a higher number of those patients in the studies? I mean, ultimately, will data quality be the same as well? And I think that is probably the least of everyone's concerns. With the devices we have today and the methodology and the SOPs, I think everybody in this industry is very comfortable with how we can collect that data remotely without affecting quality. But it's really about retention of patients and the patient experience.
Excellent. So we'll see how it shakes out. Now that decentralized trials have been proven, we know they work. What's the next frontier on improving the model?
I think it's twofold, and it really is, we need to move post-COVID. A lot of the uptake of decentralized studies was promoted by the fact that you couldn't get into sites, and so people wanted to maintain patients in studies. And so a lot of the regulators put in interim regulations that allowed some of these approaches, whether it's remote data entry, counter signature or informed consent outside of a site setting. And what hasn't, what we need to do is now embed them in the whole fundamental clinical, environment. And so I think there's going to be a lot more discussion with regulators about what we don't want to revert back to the old way of doing things, which means some of what we've seen to date needs to be really kind of embedded in future-looking regulations. And I think there's still a way to go on the home health nursing front. I mean, that also exploded as a supporting service for this decentralized approach. But in terms of how that's been regulated, what are the kind of qualifications and the training acquired around that, particularly as we're moving outside of, a lot of it was US and European centric. And when you start to apply it to global studies in multiple geographies, I think there needs to be standardization around how we do that, what that entails, the training. And I guess finally, the piece that everyone asks me about is around privacy concerns. And, traditional studies where monitors go into sites and access patient records within a site. Now we're looking at project teams working both at a site level and then with patients directly and patient data through, either the nursing networks or some of these study concierges that we have put in place to support patients in these decentralized studies. And I think the dynamic in terms of maintaining those firewalls, that role clarity, and how do you keep that is really key moving forward in terms of we need to make sure as an industry we are abiding with all the right firewalls and regulations around that.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for spending a few minutes with us and your terrific insights on where we should be looking towards DCTs in the future. So thanks so much.
It's a pleasure. Nice to be with you.